Thank you. This is very helpful for my goal, which is to, at this stage in my life, is to pass along the most important things that I have. So I appreciate your help.
Thank you for everything you have recorded in your books, your videos. Check this book. Can you see it?
Oh, yeah.
It's signed by you.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Great.
Good for me. Yeah, it's a masterpiece here in Brazil. The first time I saw this book was, I think, 4 years ago. It was 4 years ago when I was in the States, and then I started reading it and getting to know you better. And then you launched your second book. It's the Brazilian version, right? I have the American version and the Brazilian version, and I have some notes here and some questions for you. So be ready for today.
Okay.
I'll try to make it different.
All
I
right.
know you're always ready.
I'll do my best.
So Ray, your book Principles helped me a lot to understand and create principles for my team here in Brazil. And I want to start like from the top, and then we dive deeper, okay? And
Okay.
in fact, when I started my podcast, which is the most listened business podcast in Brazil nowadays, one of the first episodes we recorded was one only about your book, Principles. And on that week, we helped your book to reach the #1 position on Amazon best-selling books in Brazil. And until today, there is no higher searches for your book in Brazil since June 10th, 2019 on Google Trends. But hopefully, we will surpass this mark with the release of this conversation.
Well,
Okay?
thank you. That's terrific. Thank you.
Yes, it will happen. And I must say, one of the principles that really changed my personal life is the principle of evolution. And you wrote here, like, may the force of evolution be with you. It's even written here, right? And can you talk a little bit more about this principle before we dive deeper on the subject today?
Yeah. Well, we're always evolving, and in fact, we're all just vessels for our DNA that gets passed along, and it's evolving, and everything is evolving, and it's the greatest force in the universe. It's the only thing that remains constant is that evolution. And when we're personally evolving, there's a process of understanding ourselves. What are we like? What are we born with our DNA? And what does the environment that we've had in our early years affect us? And then we go on to chase after the things we want. And that includes succeeding, but failing. You know, if you don't know much, you start off, you're failing more and more. Even when you learn a lot, you're failing more and more. And that whole notion of making the most out of failing and the mistakes, because they're the big teachers. They teach you about reality, and they teach you how to deal with reality. So the principles that I learned came from my reflections, and I would write down the principles. What does reality work like, and how do I deal with reality? And that learning experience and the pull to what we want is our journey. And so we try to find our path in life to match our nature, so that we have, that evolutionary path. But I emphasize that in that evolutionary process, knowing one's mistakes and one's weaknesses is key to that process. I developed an instinctual principle, which is pain plus reflection equals progress. Because whenever there's pain, there's a lesson. It's a signal, there's a lesson. And that lesson is, how does reality work? And how do I deal with it well? And then I write that down. So I view it very similar to that diagram. That diagram in the beginning of the book shows an upward advance. And then it shows as you will have a setback, you will have a failure, and how you learn and diagnose that failure and how you start to do things differently can bring you up to a new high level of success. And it's kind of that. You will have successes and you will have failures, but most importantly is how you learn and evolve.
And you're talking about evolution, and it's a principle. And when we're talking about evolution, from all the videos and books that I've read from you, there is always a specific date that changed a lot of how we face economy. How did the year of 1971 specifically change the way that you view the world, and how is it important for the main message of your new book?
Yeah, so one of the big messages that I learned in 71, I learned another big message in 82. So when I was young, I started buying my first stock when I was 12 years old, and that was 1961. And I watched the markets very closely. And when I was 22 years old, I was clerking on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. And up until then, we had a system in which gold was hard money. Gold was money. And any paper money, or what we think of money today, was just like checks in a checkbook, that they actually didn't have any intrinsic value. And the United States in that 60s overspent. What it means is it wrote many more checks than it had gold in the bank. And so on August 15th, 1971, on Sunday night, I watched Richard Nixon, the president, get on the television and tell the world that the United States would not let them turn in their money, the paper money, for gold, default on its debt. And when I watched that, I was shocked. Of course, he didn't say it that way. He said it like, oh, speculators are attaching, and the United States is very strong. But what happens is you couldn't get your money. You defaulted on that obligation.
We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world.
And I walked on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and I thought, wow, this is a big crisis. And I expected that it would go down a lot. And in fact, I couldn't have been more wrong. It went up a lot. And that was because that was my first experience with a currency devaluation. So I went back in history. I studied history. And I found that the exact same thing happened by President Roosevelt on a radio on March 5th, 1933, and it produced the exact result.
And this was the first step in the government's reconstruction of our financial and economic fabric.
So I learned two things. I learned first that when there's too much debt and they can't service the debt, they will print money and devalue money. And the devaluation of money causes asset prices, causes everything to go up in that currency. That was the first thing I learned. But even more importantly, I learned that when I was surprised, it was often because of things that didn't happen in my lifetime, but happened many times in history. So I started to understand, I better understand history before. And so, for example, I studied the 1920s and the 30s very closely, which allowed me and my company, Bridgewater, to anticipate the 2007 bubble bursting to make the 2008 bad economic circumstances. And we made a lot of money in it because the way it happened was exactly the way it happened in 29 to 33. In other words, interest rates hit zero. And when the interest rate hit zero because of a debt problem and they couldn't ease anymore, they had to print money. And when they printed money, everything went up again. So that was my learning experiences. Those were my two learning experiences.
You said there are some things that happens like once in your lifetime, but sometimes they happen before you were born. Do you think that maybe some good asset allocation before we go deeper into big cycles can help your portfolio surviving or having good results? And when we talk about asset allocation, you have a concept called the Holy Grail of investing, and it's very powerful for me. Can you explain to us exactly what is the Holy Grail of investing and how can you prepare for something that never happened in your life before when we're talking about investments before we go deeper into the big cycles?
Sure, I'll do my best in the limited amount of time we have. Think of wealth as it doesn't change, it shifts. I almost think of it as like air in a balloon. If it contracts someplace, it expands elsewhere. And think of basically that there are four types of environment, two main influences: inflation and growth, economic growth, and either one of them, both of them can go up or go down. So think of four quadrants in a box. And if you diversify so that you have roughly an equal amount of risk in each one of those portfolios, each one of those buckets, so that you're having assets that you say, well, if growth is faster than expected, what assets will do well? Okay, stocks, for example, and credit spreads will narrow and so on. Or if inflation was greater than expected, what assets would I have? And of course, you would say, I'd have these inflation hedge assets. And then you go to the other box. If growth is less than expected, what assets would I like to have? And you might have then government bonds and so on. So by creating that balance in the portfolio, you substantially reduce your risk without reducing your expected return. My goal, or the holy grail of investing, is if you can have uncorrelated return streams that balance each other. Now, the holy grail is get 10 or 15 equally good return streams. That could be an asset class, it could be any investment, whatever the investment is. Get 10 or 15 of those, you can reduce your risk by 80% without reducing your return. And so to know how to diversify so that it doesn't reduce your return, but it reduces your risk, allows you to improve your return to risk ratio by a factor of 5. And that's the power of what I call all weather, or the holy grail of investing. In a nutshell, find 10 or 15, or even maybe it's 5 or 6 or 7 good uncorrelated return streams. And all of those assets over a period of time will outperform cash over a period of time, because the system depends on that. Cash is what central banks put on deposit, and people with better ideas come along and they borrow cash and they fund it. And so that is the holy grail of investing, which I also describe as the all-weather portfolio. One other point that you have to understand is don't always look at investing based on stocks going up, okay? The world wants everything to go up. The world wants stocks to go up. The world wants the economy to go up. So the world has a real bias. And central banks want everything to go up. And how do they make everything go up? They make everything go up by injecting credit, which becomes debt. But you can't make everything go up that way. The only way you can make everything go up over a period of time is be more productive, produce more output. But you can't do it through the creation of money and credit. That won't do it. Because of that, that creates a very big cycle and a real bias in everybody's portfolio. Up, 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 up. And what that does is it means that there are a lot of liabilities. In other words, when you create credit, you create a debt. And one man's debts are another man's assets. And so what happens is when there's a lot of debt, the central banks are in a bind, because that's a burden that can crush the economy and can crush everything. So what they do is they print a lot more money. And so the way they get out of it is by printing a lot more money and devaluing money. So you must understand that. Don't always look at investing as, when is it going to go up? And when will it go? Because you can have a decade like the 1970s, or Brazil has had many decades, in terms of the real returns of asset prices being annihilated. And so understand that balance of your portfolio, so that you know how to have that balance that I'm talking about. Understand how important that balance is, because you may not be able to time it. Adding value and making money on a timing basis is very difficult. And an amateur really can't do that very well. It's like trying to compete in the Olympics. You know, it's tougher to compete in the markets than to compete in the Olympics, because there's more people trying to do it and bigger rewards. So that notion of an all-weather portfolio, a balanced portfolio, so that it performs well in any environment, is a better way of approaching it than to be in a position of always betting everything is going to go up, because it won't. If there's a lot of financial obligations that are out there, they cannot get a high real return.
On your most recent book, there is something that got my attention, because you divide the book in three parts. One of it, you talk about how the world works. One part of it, you talk about how the last 500 years worked. And the third part, you talk about the future. So 2/3 of your book is talking about the past. And you are telling me when we started this conversation that you needed to study a lot about history to make better decisions on the investments, on the portfolios. When you talk about big cycles in the book, you said that we first start with the peace, prosperity, and productivity. Then we have the financial bubble, financial burst, printing money, revolutions, debt, and a new world order. And I recall that Mark Twain once said, and you probably know the quote, that history never repeats itself, but it does often rhyme. And in your opinion, does history do more than just rhyme?
Yes, the same things happen for the same reasons. Everything that happens because of causes that precede it, that happened before it. And so it becomes logical. For example, when countries have a lot of debt and they have to face a choice of paying that with hard dollars, which will crush the economy, or printing money, which will produce inflation and devalue the money, they always end up making that choice. But if they don't have that choice, if they have a lot of savings, they don't have a lot of debt, then they're in a different position. And such things happen over time. So there's a cycle. I wanted to describe the cycle. There's an internal order and there's an external order. And by order, I mean system. How does the system work? So let's take the external order, the world order, as we call it. The world order is a system that is existed, and it usually almost always follows a war. So the last time the world system began, the world order began, was 1945, following World War II. And the most dominant power gets to set the rules, and that was the United States, because it had 80% of the world's gold, which was money then. It had 50% of world GDP, and it had a monopoly on the military power. So that set off, as a result, it had the reserve currency, and that's why the United Nations is in New York, and the World Bank and the IMF are in Washington, D.C., because it was the American world order set by the United States. And they carve up countries. They say, what are the boundaries and what are the rules? And over a period of time, that the next stage is that there's a period of peace and prosperity. Peace, because no one wants to fight the dominant power. And that peace and then the rebuilding creates prosperity. And that prosperity takes place, and it develops a world's reserve currency, because the commonly used currency around the world becomes a reserve currency. And when that becomes a reserve money, others want to save in it, not just the people from that country. And so they build up the savings in it, that's called their reserves. And then what they do when they are holding that, they're lending to the country. And as a result, the country borrows money. The reserve currency country always borrows money. And they also get more in debt because of the fact that there's a prosperity and safeness. And people then want to increasingly bet on that. The stock market goes up, the bond market, and they all say, oh, it's good, I want to borrow and invest. And so that produces more debt. And it also produces wealth gaps, because wealth gets distributed differently. Some people make a lot of wealth and some people don't make a lot of wealth. And so you see that the debts rise, and you see that the wealth gaps rise. And so you find the financial condition begins to deteriorate. You also find that other countries begin to compete with the leading country. The way China, for example, is increasingly competing with the United States. As the United States gets more in debt and has larger wealth gaps, then you see China also competing. Since I started to go to China, per capita income is in 1984 I started. Since then, per capita income has increased by 26 times. And it's become so almost a comparable power. And so when you see those three things occur, that there's more levels of indebtedness, and there's then internal conflict over the wealth gaps and different values gaps, and you see that there's also challenges from the outside, then that's a risky situation. It causes financial risk. It causes internal conflict risk, fighting internally in different ways, well, like we're seeing in the United States or we're seeing in a number of countries. And it also causes the greater risk externally of a conflict because there's comparable powers any longer. It's no longer the world order in which the United States then says this is going to operate this way or has the dominant power, because then you have bigger conflicts. And then what you do is through history, how are those conflicts resolved? There are 5 types of wars. There is a trade war, a technology war, a geopolitical influence war, a capital and economic war, and a military war. And through the history, the first ones of those happened first, and then they intensify. And when you use economics and capital markets as a weapon, then that becomes very close to having a military war. So you see this, for example, in the 1930s in Japan. The United States froze Japanese assets and cut off the oil in terms of an economic war, which led to Pearl Harbor. So that cycle, that you then have another war and you determine who's in power, and then you come and set up another world order, the new world order, is the cycle. So if I studied the last 500 years of history, and I could take you through how the Spanish Empire was followed by really the Dutch became the richest and dominant power, then the British Empire, then the American Empire, and then we're seeing that decline of the relative American empire with the rise of China, and now we're seeing the comparability, and we're seeing the internal conflict, and we're also seeing the financial issues. So that's how the cycle works, and almost you can, when you watch it and you connect it to what the news is doing, and you see every day, okay? So you watch the news. January 6th incident where there's an attack for control on Washington is very much out of the book. When there's populists of the left and populists of the right. Populists are people who will fight and won't want to lose, and they'll fight for control. And when you get that kind of a movement. So yes, history does more than rhyme. It operates in these cycles of sensible, logical, cause-effect relationships in which one thing leads to another.
It's very interesting to see how you showed us how the big cycles work and proved it, talking about the last 500 years. And when we see the news and everyday's news, we can check that everything you are mentioning is really happening on the TVs, on all portals. Before I ask the next question, I want to make a quick question, because we're talking a lot about China. And I remember that maybe 6 or 7 months ago, I was in New York and I met Lexi and John from Bridgewater, and they were incredible. And they talked a lot about how you have a special background. When we're talking about the special background, and before I go to the next question, when we talk about China, do you think we need to have some portion of our portfolio exposing to China or something? I mean,
yes.
Yes.
I think China is comparable in size as in the United States, as the US economy, depending on whether you're looking at it in local currency terms or that, but it's roughly about the same size. And I'm saying it's inventive in technologies, big technologies in many, many ways. And it's also been growing at a fast pace. And it also has developed the second largest capital markets in the world. So the United States has its super advantages and its uniqueness, and so you have to have money in the United States, but there's a competition there, so you have to have them in both, and you have to have them in a number of other countries. So some percentage of the portfolio, when I say that, I don't mean dominant, but I think that if you're looking at it, that might be between 15% and maybe 15 and 20% of the portfolio, depending on what else is in the portfolio.
And Ray, I think that different background to the same information will lead you to different conclusions, okay? And you have a great knowledge from your own experience, plus a lot of studying. And you have been to many countries, including China. And I suppose have learned a lot from those experiences. And is there something that you have been watching or concluding and believe nobody else is paying attention to?
How there are three things I want to keep emphasizing. There are more, but there are three things that are paramount importance when I look at a country's health, which also means where I want to invest. The first is the financial health. Are they earning more than they are spending so that they have a good income statement and a good balance sheet so that they can withstand difficult times and also take advantage of good times? So what is financially? Second question, do they work well together, or is there a lot of internal conflict? How effective is this society in working well together to be productive? And the third is that are they at risk of an international war of some form, conflict of some form, or not? If I go to places in which they are they're good financially and they're good internally, that they work well together in an efficient, competitive environment where the legal system works well, corruption levels are low, and so on. That is an area that I want to invest in. And then also, are they at risk of an international conflict? So I could almost score along those lines where I want to invest on the basis of those things.
And Ray, just so our audience that doesn't have your book already, they could know, your book have some small red dots on this book that shows us what are the most important parts of the book, and I really loved it. And I want to make a question about principles for you, because when you're talking about world order, you navigate through the big cycles and all the concepts using principles. So they're very important for us. And when we are talking about principles, I would like to present you our main principle here in my company, okay? The symbol of this principle is an apple. See, this is a small apple, sorry, but the thing is, the story behind it is that you could know how many seeds are inside an apple by opening it, but you'll never be able to find out how many apples are inside a single seed. And that would be the law of sowing. And what you plant today has infinite multiplication potential in the future. And it works on your job, on your money, on the love for a beloved one. And I'm asking this to hear your perspective about your own principles. I mean, are they laws of nature? Are they divine laws? I mean, how do you see the principles you just wrote on your books?
Reality works how reality works. I mean, it works like a machine. Every
Very good.
thing that happens has causes that make it happen beforehand. So knowing how reality works is very important. Look at it almost mechanistically. What are the causes? What are the effects? And then what are my principles for dealing with reality that work? And I would encourage you, I'd encourage all your audience to write down when they're having an experience, what is the decision rules that they are using to make those decisions? Write them down. That will be your principles. Because, for example, think about the success that you've had in building your show. Fantastic. You made decisions along the way. That's your recipe book for success. When you write it down, it makes you think about it more clearly. It also allows you to pass it to others that you're working with, or pass it to others beyond you, and pass it to others outside of who you're working with. I think that my principles will be there when I'm not there, when my grandchildren get older. That writing it down means that you are describing how reality works and how to interact with it to get what you want. Yeah, they're very important. They're timeless and universal laws that happen over and over again.
Well, reality is reality. Very good quote. And just a little extra addition to this, one of your main principles about life is accepting reality and knowing how to deal with it. And how did you come up with that principle? Does it have something to do with Stoicism? And it makes sense, but it's much harder to do it than to know we need to do it. I mean, is there any tip on that?
Well, it wasn't me studying Stoicism. No. Although, that could be simple. I don't know enough about it to really say. I think that reality is a teacher. And in my case, I'm dealing with the markets every day. And I know that if I'm not realistic, I receive penalties and rewards constantly about how I'm making decisions. So the feedback loop teaches me that, okay, how does reality work? And what are my principles? And I write them down. So I think that that's had a big effect on my accepting reality. Also, whenever the things happen to me or us, they happen. It tells you something about reality. So it's like the serenity prayer, there's a serenity prayer. God, give me the serenity to accept that which I can't control, and the wisdom and the power to control that which I can control, and the wisdom to tell the difference. The understanding of reality and dealing with it on that is what life teaches you. You'll get shocks and pain if you don't do it right. You'll get rewards if you do it right. So it's part of your training, part of your evolution process. So that has been, in my case, that's how I learned it. I also learned meditation, transcendental meditation. I think that's helped me a lot because the transcendental meditation has given me a calmness, an equanimity, a calmness that I can approach anything with and just saying, okay, this thing is coming at me. And how do I deal with that thing? And there's that acceptance. So I think those were the influences that made me more able to look at reality in the way I look at it and then think about principles for dealing with it well.
I have just two more questions for you, Ray. One of them is there something about the future that worries you? I mean, as we are maybe near one of the worst financial crises we have ever seen, as you mentioned somewhere, I'm not sure where you mentioned it. Like, are we living in a bubble?
I believe that we are in a period of time in which there's the risks of a financial crisis, particularly a stagflation, that severe stagflation globally, are in the vicinity of 70%. And I believe that we are at risk, a 30 to 40% chance over the next 5 years of having a type of civil war in the United States or elsewhere because of the internal conflict. In other words, the rejection of rule by law and the Constitution because both sides are fighting to win. And I believe that we have a similar risk, 30 to 40%, of a international war that would be very painful. First, a much worse economic war. For example, if China gets sanctioned and it becomes like Russia, that you can't operate, businesses can't operate there. There's so much that comes from China in terms of goods and services. Or you could actually have some military conflict. So when I look at those three things together, I worry about those things. At the same time, I have a principle, which is if you worry, you don't have to worry. And if you don't worry, you need to worry. And what I mean by that is if you do worry about that, then you will take actions to protect yourself against that. And you can. There are various things that could be done, either collectively by operating in a bipartisan sound way together to deal with the problems, or individually. One of the important aspects of writing that book was to be able to pass along rules to help. For example, I have a rule. It's a Chinese rule that saying a smart rabbit has 3 holes, or when in doubt, get out. And that means that when you get to a certain set of circumstances, how do you have a place where you're going to operate? How do you diversify? Well, it's like the foreign exchange controls and things. There are other things that I put in the book that allow individuals to protect themselves in order to operate that way. So if you worry, you have to worry less because you've established those types of protections. But I do worry about those things that we're talking about.
And the last question for the younger Ray Dalio, okay? The last principle you mentioned in your new book is the following: triangulate among the smartest people possible. And that's all about networking. But I see many people don't know how to do it properly. And I remember there is a passage in the Bible where Jesus is on top of a mountain doing the Sermon of the Mount. And he says something like this: I give unto you to be the salt of the earth. And I'm not talking about the spiritual aspect of this. I want to bring a practical application for this principle. Well, he's telling us we are the salt of the earth, and we use salt to salt the meat. But when it's tasty, the merit doesn't go to the salt. It goes to the meat. And the mistake that most people make is that they want to be congratulated for being the salt. So my question is, you are Ray Dalio today, and I really want to talk to you today. I want to be the salt in your life. It's one of my dreams becoming true. But what was your strategy for the younger Dalio to reach the best people around you when you were not the same Ray Dalio you are nowadays? And how to retain those good talents and those people around you for so long time in your company, for example, in your friends relations around you? How do you do that?
As you're evolving, of course, you learn more, and you're talking about the phases of life. But for me, meaningful work and meaningful relationships are what it's about. In other words, I want both. I want to be on a mission that I'm excited about, that my work and my passion are the same things. So I would say, first, make your work and your passion the same thing, and don't forget about the money part, because you also have to deal with that. But make your work and your passion the same thing, and do that with meaningful work and meaningful relationships, because they reinforce each other. And that's exactly right, what you said. When you have those meaningful relationships in which there's a joy, that there's love to me means that you care about the other person so that their well-being and their success is very important. It's rewarding to you. When you have that meaningful work and you have the meaningful relationship, and then you go on the journey together, that's powerful. And regarding seeing differently, triangulating differently, finding the smartest people who think differently than you and may see different perspectives, that's so important, because by taking in through that radical open-mindedness, when you think that you have an opinion and you stress test the opinion by having the smartest people disagree with you and you listen to it, because if there's a disagreement, somebody's going to be wrong. And how do you know that you're not the wrong one? So that radical open-mindedness of triangulating with other people who see things differently is a great power, because it allows you to pick what the best ways of thinking are, and it allows you to learn. So all of those things, meaningful work, meaningful relationship, follow your passion, know yourselves, and then also to triangulate well, because you just have to know the best decisions to make. They don't all have to come from you. That's very powerful, I think.
Ray, would you send me a signed copy of your book?
Of course. I look forward to it. Yeah.
And would you send me 10 signed copies of your book so I can distribute to my audience here in Brazil?
I'd be thrilled to. No,
Ray,
I'm very grateful for you, because at this stage in my life, my main objective is to try to pass along things that will be helpful to others, because that's my role. That's my natural inclination at this stage of my life, and I appreciate you allowing me or helping me to do that.
Ray, I have more than 1,000 questions I want to make to you, so thank you very much. This was a very special day for me. I hope it was for you also. Thank you so much.
Thank you.